So we can obviously think about evidence in very different ways, and I decided to use the time today to mostly speak as a criminologist who's using evidence really for 5 different types of audiences, for the academic audience, for my students, for my community research partners, then sometimes for news and media, and also as a 5th group for policymakers and criminal justice organizations. And I want to spend my time in the opening remarks to basically put my emphasis on that last group, so the policymakers and the criminal justice organizations. So at the very core of what I do stands my ethical obligation to use the privilege that I have in this society to conduct research in partnership with communities and use the evidence that I'm gathering in my research projects to leave the world a better place in a very pragmatic, concrete kind of way. I know that sounds a little cheesy, but really is what drives me as a researcher. And because I see it as my main responsibility to use my findings to drive social change, I'm particularly attuned to the fact that I need to bring the evidence that I'm gathering in my research projects to the people who are in positions to have real life impacts, such as my community partners, for example, but also policymakers. And speaking as a criminologist who's very concerned about the many inequalities that my participants face, I like to bring my evidence to criminal justice organizations who are often very much stuck in their way of thinking and in their practices, such as the police or the correctional apparatus. So a big part of the discussion today will probably be what exactly is evidence. And when you turn to any sort of dictionary, you can see that evidence is anything that can be used to prove something. So what that essentially means is that the term cannot be equated with data or facts. And it also means that we as scholars can or may cherry pick our data to essentially find evidence that will support our predetermined conclusions or political leanings, et cetera, et cetera. But because I said I'm going to speak as a criminologist who's using evidence to potentially foster some change with criminal justice organizations, in my goals to use my findings to drive that social change, I have to be strongly committed to using evidence that is grounded in robust data to support my findings and the recommendations that I'm bringing forward. If I don't do that, I will essentially lose the ear of the people and the organizations that I feel need to hear about my findings. More importantly, I would certainly lose legitimacy as a researcher and therefore use my ability to use my research and my privilege to foster change. So using data and research to form an evidence base is pretty much the only way that as a criminologist I can convince criminal justice organizations who've been stuck in their way of thinking for many centuries oftentimes to rethink their policies and their practices. And some of my colleagues think it's not really possible to change the thinking and the practices of organizations, but I can think of many examples in which I have been successful to do so, and I just for the sake of time, I want to share one such examples. So from the mid to the late 1980s, Gordon Domini, who was an Anglican priest working for a youth detention center here in the city, allegedly sexually assaulted a number of 12 to 14-year-old boys in his care. And after a forensic witness interview in 2015, which is about 20 years later, one of the complainants, who was now an adult, went home and committed suicide. 5 of his co-complainants had become career offenders and were incarcerated at the time of their forensic witness interviews. And despite having been compelled under subpoena to recount their victimization histories in court, they were not provided any victim support services in jail because they were incarcerated at the time of their court hearing. So Domini's victims exemplify the general tendency in the criminal justice system to conceive offenders as just offenders. So criminals who've been caught, convicted, and therefore ought to be punished, despite the fact that many of them have been victims first. And when one of my research partners, Dan Jones, who's not here today, brought the lack of victim services for prisoners to the attention of the Correctional Ministry, a then member of the Solicitor General's office stated that prisons are only places to punish people, and that victim services will not be implemented in this province ever, and only over his dead body. So in the Canadian context, we have literally no data or evidence whatsoever on the fact that many prisoners are also victims. So when my collaborator was going to the Solicitor General's office, he had no evidence to prove that these 5 co-complainants were not just a minority. So now, as the co-leader of the University of Alberta Prison Project, Kevin Haggerty, my collaborator, several students, Dan Jones and I have now been able to collect systematic data on the sexual, physical, and property victimization experiences of 300 prisoners in this province before they were first arrested. And being able to document and show that over 80% of our sample were victims before being arrested, and sharing their often heartbreaking stories, victim services has now been implemented in the Edmonton Remand Center. And this is something that we think would have been unthinkable without traditional data that forms our evidence base. Prisoners are by and large seen as a population not worthy of programs or supports in society. And the fact that our evidence had such a positive impact has now been covered last month by the McLean Journal with a big article on our collaborator, Dan Jones. So hopefully we'll be able to use this data that forms our evidence base to convince more ministries and prisons to implement such changes. We've also been invited to share these data with the Indigenous Women's Justice Forum, with the Judges Educational Conference in this province, to essentially see whether or not our evidence can have an impact on sentencing. We've presented to the Canadian Bar Foundation and to the Crown's Prosecutor's Office. Let's stop here. Thank you.